Caroline emerged from the pastry shop and walked toward the car, noticing her husband standing on the sidewalk, gazing into the distance. "David," she called out, her voice laced with irritation. "Why are you frozen? Come on, let's go. We're already late. Everyone's probably already gathered at the table, and we're the only ones missing." It was as if David hadn't heard her. Caroline couldn't stand it any longer. She walked over and tugged at his sleeve. He looked at her with a strange expression, then, as if reluctantly, headed for the car. Caroline continued to grumble as they drove, while David's thoughts drifted to the past, to a time before Caroline when he was married to Nicole, a quiet, modest, and loving woman. Nicole was his first love and his first wife. They had been so happy until Caroline entered his life. Then Nicole had died. She had been in a terrible, senseless accident. There was nothing David could do for her. He had sobbed uncontrollably, clutching her coffin and begging for her forgiveness. But even then, in those bitter days of despair, he hadn't truly grasped what he had lost. After Nicole was gone, he hadn't known a single hour of happiness. Not even when Caroline gave birth to their son. David felt like an outsider in his new family, often wondering where it had all gone wrong. It had probably started the day Caroline appeared at the company where David worked. Elegant, long-legged, and impeccably dressed, she held her head high as she strode to her desk as if she were not a staff economist but a director. David, the head of the department at the time, often had to work with Caroline on business matters, sometimes staying late together to review documents. One day, their professional relationship crossed the line that usually separated colleagues. Caroline was the instigator. It was late evening, and they were in the office, finishing up a summary of the company's profit figures. Suddenly, Caroline stood up, stretched gracefully, and walked over to sit on David's lap. "What are you doing?" he whispered, taken aback. She silently untied his tie with her thin, nimble fingers, unbuttoned his shirt collar, and pressed her lips to his. "Caroline, I'm married," David protested, but she moved on to more daring caresses. David couldn't push her away. Meanwhile, faithful and loyal Nicole was waiting for him at home. David felt an overwhelming sense of shame towards his wife, but he couldn't refuse Caroline. With each encounter, his guilt grew. Then, one day, Caroline told him she was pregnant. "David, you have to make a decision, a choice between your wife and our baby. I hope you won't make the baby suffer." David finally realized the extent of his actions. The passion Caroline had skillfully ignited in him had nothing to do with love. It was a feeling he had reserved solely for Nicole, and he didn't want to lose her. Yes, he had betrayed her, but perhaps one day she would forgive him. "Caroline, I'm sorry," David mumbled. "Everything that happened between us was a mistake. I'm not abandoning the baby, and of course, I'll help you, but my family is Nicole." Caroline had a fiery temper. She didn't cry, as another woman might have. Instead, she smiled vindicatively. "So, you want to remain a faithful husband? And do you think your wife will forgive you? Or has she already forgiven you? Doesn't she have an ounce of womanly pride in her?" "No, I haven't spoken to her yet," David shook his head. "She's gone to visit her parents. I'll wait for her and tell her everything when she comes back." But Nicole never came back. 2 days after their conversation, her mother called, informing David that Nicole had been in a terrible accident and died. "We'll bury her here," Mrs. Mitchell said, her voice firm. "I want to be near my daughter. And you, if you want, may come to visit her grave." She said something else, but David couldn't hear her. He was in a fog, and only upon falling to his knees beside his wife's closed coffin did he sob uncontrollably, regretting his failure to protect his beloved and his betrayal of her. Years passed. David was now married to Caroline and they were raising their young son. Today, they were visiting a nearby state to celebrate Caroline's aunt's 50th anniversary. As they arrived in town, Caroline asked her husband to stop outside a candy store. While his wife was inside, David looked around the unfamiliar streets with interest. Suddenly, his gaze fell on a slender figure emerging from a store across the street. David shuddered as if he had been electrocuted. It was Nicole, his Nicole, the same Nicole he had mourned for all these years. How many times, secretly from Caroline, had he visited the cemetery, sat by his first wife's grave, and spoken to her as if she were alive? And now, he saw her standing before him, alive. David wanted to rush after her, to call out, "Nicole," but the cry froze on his lips, his feet rooted to the ground. It was a shock, and David was paralyzed. Just then, Caroline returned. David had to make a monumental effort to get into the car, and, consumed by his memories, he barely paid attention to the road. When they arrived at the celebration and Caroline's family gathered at the table, David told his wife he wasn't feeling well and retreated to a room to rest. Finally, alone, he could quietly delve into his thoughts. A happy family with Caroline had never been in the cards. Powerful and opinionated, she was not accustomed to considering anyone else's perspective. The first 2 years after their son's birth were a nightmare for David. He had hoped Caroline's pregnant whims would disappear after the baby arrived, but it turned out to be only the beginning. Caroline demanded that David rush to her at her first call, disrupting important negotiations. One day, she begged him to come urgently without explaining anything over the phone. David, frantic with worry for his child, drove home at breakneck speed, barely touching the ground with his car's wheels. But the door was opened by a smiling Caroline. "You came, how nice," she exclaimed, clapping her hands in satisfaction. "I missed you so much." "What's wrong with our son?" David shouted, his temper flaring. "Nothing. He's asleep. What could happen to him?" "Caroline, what are you doing? Do you realize I had an important meeting, and I dropped everything and rushed to you?" "That's good, it means you love me," Caroline laughed back. But he didn't love her. He had never loved her. Only Nicole resided in his heart. But she was dead. Or was she? The thought overwhelmed David, and he sat up abruptly on the couch. He hadn't seen her dead, after all. The coffin had been closed. And the funeral had been strange. David only now realized that Nicole's mother hadn't cried at all. At the time, he had attributed it to shock, but now he saw the situation in a completely different light. Exhausted by his heavy thoughts, David collapsed back onto the couch. When Caroline stopped by to inquire about his well-being, he already had a plan. "Caroline, I'm sorry, I have to leave right away." "Wait. Tomorrow night we're going to a restaurant, it's my aunt's anniversary, and there will be a lot of guests." "I'll try to make it," David promised, and despite his wife's displeasure, he got into the car and drove away. On the way, he stopped at a construction store, purchased 2 shovels, work gloves, and a flashlight, and then continued on his journey. He arrived at the cemetery where Nicole was buried in the evening when it was quite dark. He followed a familiar path to his wife's grave and began to dig. David, unaccustomed to physical labor, quickly developed blisters. But that didn't stop him. Hour after hour passed, and he kept digging, stopping only briefly to rest. Finally, the shovel struck the coffin lid. David sighed heavily. Only now did he realize he wouldn't be able to get the coffin to the surface. His nerves, as well as his physical strength, were at their limit. So, he decided to open the coffin lid right there in the grave. The shovel clanged against the half-rotted boards, creating a large gap in the coffin. When he managed to tear the lid off, he wept bitterly, realizing he had buried several years ago. David met Dawn, sitting in the grave, surrounded by the wreckage of a wooden coffin. In his hands were albums of photographs, capturing him and Nicole when they were young and happy. Here, in the coffin, David found a box covered in scarlet velvet, a gift he had once given to his wife. She had kept all his gifts and tokens of affection inside. And all this meant only one thing: that day, he hadn't buried his wife, but her love and his happiness. After retrieving everything from the grave, David somehow managed to fill it back in, then, crushed by everything that had happened, he headed for the exit, drained of energy. He got behind the wheel, drank some water, and immediately, without leaving the cemetery, fell into a deep sleep. That evening, Caroline was furious when she realized David hadn't arrived on time. She approached her aunt and apologized to her husband. "I didn't expect anything else from him," the aunt smirked. "You know, I never liked your David. He doesn't compare to Mason." "Auntie, come on. You know Mason wasn't as malleable as David. When Mason found out I was pregnant, he demanded I get an abortion. But I had already done it a few times, and the doctors warned me that this was probably my last chance to become a mother. I couldn't let it go. Besides, I wanted to get back at Mason, so I turned my attention to David." Caroline laughed. "Oh, if you could have known how crazy Mason was when he found out I started dating David." "So, David has no idea he's raising a son who isn't his?" the aunt asked with a smile. "Of course not, he's so trusting." While talking, the women didn't notice David approaching from behind, carrying a huge bouquet of flowers. "Well," he said, "it's a good thing there's no need for explanations now." "David, you've got it all wrong." "I'll explain," Caroline whispered, confused. "I got it all wrong before. And now everything is falling into place. Happy birthday." David handed the flowers to the woman celebrating her anniversary, then turned and walked away. Caroline rushed after him, grabbed his arm, and began to plead with him to listen. But he calmly pulled away the weeping woman, and Caroline realized she had made an irreversible mistake. David drove straight to Mrs. Mitchell's house and asked the question that had been tormenting him. "Is Nicole alive?" "Don't keep quiet, Mrs. Mitchell, I know everything. I saw her. And I checked at night, and she's not in the coffin. I love your daughter, and I've only ever loved her." "David, if you loved her, then you wouldn't have cheated on her." "How do you know that?" David looked at her, ashamed. "One evening, when Nicole was visiting me, she got a cell phone call. It was your mistress. She told Nicole she was expecting a child from you. And that you loved her. Nicole didn't tell me anything at the time, she just went to her room. She was gone for a long time, and I decided to check on her. I was horrified to see a handful of pills in her hands. She had already taken some, and I called an ambulance to save my little girl. Do you realize I could have lost her?" David sat with his head bowed. Mrs. Mitchell continued ruthlessly. "Oh, David. If you only knew how much she loved you. Then, in the hospital, she kept saying she didn't want to live anymore. I suggested she talk to you. But she decided that since you had chosen someone else, she wouldn't bother you. You see, she decided to set you free. Rightly or wrongly, I supported her. Even though I knew full well that one day the truth would come out and you'd find out. Where is Nicole now? I want to see her." "Why? To torture her again?" "Please, David, don't disturb her life." "I won't give her up to anyone." David shook his head. "And I'll do anything to make her forgive me." "David, she loves you. She still can't get over you. But whether she'll forgive you, I don't know." Mrs. Mitchell sighed and gave him her address. Hearing the doorbell ring, Nicole opened the door and immediately went pale. Standing before her was David, her first and only love, a love she had never managed to erase from her memory. They stared at each other in silence, their eyes locked. Finally, Nicole pulled herself together and asked why he had come. "To tell you that I love you. And always have. I made a terrible mistake once, and I'll never forgive myself for it. Nicole, I'll beg you every day to forgive me. Go away. I don't believe you. You killed our love, and I buried it. Look what I have. This is proof that our love cannot be buried." Nicole looked and recoiled when she saw the photo albums and the scarlet box she had once buried. "Please, David, go away. I won't ruin your family. You have a child. No family and no baby. She deceived me, he's not my son. That doesn't change anything. So, once again, please go away." Nicole said bitterly and closed the door, but David didn't move. He lowered himself along the wall and sat on the floor, wrapping his arms around his knees. He knew firmly that he would do anything to get Nicole back, and he felt that there, behind the door, she was just like him, sitting on the floor, listening to the beating of the heart he had hurt. 3 years passed. David and Nicole were taking a walk in the park near their house. Their little son was sleeping soundly in his stroller, which David pushed in front of him. He put his other arm around his wife's newly rounded waist. "Darling, how lucky I am to have you in my life," David said, stopping and kissing Nicole. "I've been so stupid and blind. But now I will do anything to make you and our children happy. And I love you, David. You know, I felt so bad without you for those few awful years," Nicole said. "Please don't remember. I won't forget for the rest of my life what I owe you." Nicole smiled, looking into her husband's eyes. "Well, everyone in life can make mistakes." "Yes, but not everyone can forgive," David replied and hugged his wife again.